Hi, I'm Don Taylor. I'm the chairman of the Learning and Skills Group and the Learning Technologies Conference. And I'm here today with Jon Husband, our keynote speaker at the Learning Technologies Summer Forum. Jon, you've done a great job of this morning explaining to people something of the background of your key term that you've brought to not just the world of learning, but of organizational understanding, wierarchy. But people listening to this won't necessarily know it. Can you boil down for us, what does wierarchy mean and why is it important?
Okay, sure.
And you might want to bring your mic closer.
So, as I recounted in the presentation, for quite a number of years, going back to university, I was interested in the sociology and the social architecture of work and organizations and why people do what they do. It always was of interest to me. I have curiosity about it, what motivates people. So that's why I studied psychology and sociology. And then I went about, becoming an adult, getting a job, trying to establish a career. I ended up as a management consultant in one of the world's large global HR consulting firms.
Bring the mic closer to your mouth.
I learned all of the methods, the protocols, the philosophy, the reasons for structuring organizations hierarchically with org charts and so on. And when I started doing that work, which would have been in the mid-1980s, the internet and the web weren't in sight, weren't around, but I was beginning to get interested in and curious about futurists like John Naisbitt, Alvin Toffler, Peter Drucker, who had started talking about the coming information age and the advent of the information age and knowledge work and so on. And I'm remembering that I began working when there weren't computers in the workplace. And then I saw electronic calculators come in, and then the initial desktop computers, which were basically replacements for the typewriters for administrative assistants and secretaries. But as we went along, it became clearer and clearer and clearer to me that information technology, databases, and capabilities would change the nature of work. And then along came the internet and the web. And there was the dot-com boom and the dot-com bust, and everybody kind of went, oh, this isn't that big a deal. But by that time, I had become convinced that these issues and the presence of computers and networks would just, electronic networks, would just keep growing into the future. And it got to be such a convincing idea in my head that I quit my job as a management consultant, because the existing and still the widely used methods and practices for organizational structure, management practices, and so on are based on the notion that knowledge is gathered together, put into various structures, and then used top down. In other words, the person that you report to knows more than you, and she who reports to vice president or president or whatever, the position above, knows more. And this goes all the way back to the beginnings of the use of information knowledge by the human race, with the notion that God is the fount of all knowledge. The archangels are the vice presidents, moved through society in the Middle Ages, and kings and queens, through the divine right of kings, became the representatives of of God on earth, and therefore the sources of knowledge and the holders of strategic knowledge. The cardinals and bishops were the ones that transmitted the knowledge from the kings and queens through to the monks who wrote it all down. Along came the printing press. It took about 200 years for the printing press to have its real dramatic impact on society. And now there's computers and hyperlinks and connected information flows. So I started thinking about the fact that hyperlinks and information flows and connected people and networks meant that knowledge and information were being used more and more horizontally, laterally. People were passing around information. We see examples of this now in things that have been enabled by electronic networks, such as the Arab Spring or the NSA or WikiLeaks, or more recently the Panama Papers. And the same kinds of phenomenon are happening in organizations and with markets. The first instances of the use of social computing tools and social media was in marketers trying to reach out to the markets and their clients in networks. And now it's very slowly, because of the issues in organizational design having dramatic impact on the workplace and the way work is done, and it's being resisted, of course, by the existing power structures. So I put all that together and started thinking about what's the archy of living in a wired world. And, I just connected wired, wierarchy. But because I'd been working in this area for the last 30, 35 years, I pretty much understood what I meant, or what this made up word meant.
Right.
And so wierarchy is a definition. It still involves deeply the use of knowledge, trust, credibility, and a focus on results. But it's a dynamic flow as opposed to just a top-down utilization.
Wierarchy stands in contrast to hierarchy.
I would argue that it's an evolution of hierarchy. People need hierarchy to make decisions, to have trust, to understand roles and where they are in structures. But what I think it really implies, and again, we're early into all this thing, is what I'd argue would be more informed, intelligent, and enlightened hierarchy that's going to be more fluid and more transient. In other words, it's temporary. We're already arguably seeing that because the tenure of many executives is a lot shorter than it used to be.
Sure.
Because there are changes in their business, changes in their market, and so on. So they either don't do a good job and get fired, or they come up against another opportunity if they're good performers and they move on. But the tenure has, I think, halved in the last 10 years.
Is it possible that people hiring chief executives are hiring for a new role with increased ambiguity against an old definition, which requires people to be very well labeled and to have a very clear definition of their skills? And in fact, that people's ability to cope with ambiguity isn't part of the skill set that actually a new CEO needs?
I think that's a very, very good question. And I think there's a lot of that going on because, again, the methods, practices of that whole area, people, human resources, recruiting, they're still using, by and large, these core fundamental assumptions about knowledge, work, seniority, gravitas, business acumen, and there are competency models that have been built over the last 20 years for most executive roles, and those are what are used to do the recruiting and so on. On the other hand, some of the more esoteric and or leading edge models for leadership development, I'm thinking one in particular that got a fair bit of airplay about 10 or 15 years ago, but I don't think has gotten taken on board that much, was a model called Level 5 Leadership by Jim Collins, the guy that wrote the book Good to Great, and there's more and more of this coming out, that the great leaders today are the people that know how to enable others. And that comes from a combination of curiosity, humility, being able to listen. I've coined a term of moving from command and control to champion and channel. Champion new ideas, channel resources to them, see what takes root. If it doesn't take root, abandon it, move on to the next idea, because information flows are making business concepts and markets be in constant motion.
So I can understand why wierarchy is fundamental to a view of how organizations are set up in the future. How does wierarchy affect the practice of learning and development?
Well, we talked about it a little bit and you asked some questions. My take on it is, there's been a lot of change and it's accelerating in the learning and development field, particularly over the last 5 years. I think the first 5 years since arguably the web began to be apparent in the workplace was met with resistance, confusion, denial, ignoring. And then there have been developments in LMS systems and in the XAPI and other things that have meant we're starting to try to adapt. That's through blended learning, just-in-time performance support, adaptive pathways, and so on and so forth. But I think there's still a lot of people looking, and some of the questions that were asked about, for example, I think the fellow named Donald Park that said, I'm an either or person. It's, this is the way I want it. I don't want to deal with both and situations. I think L&D professionals have typically been what I would call mechanics. They know the techniques, the tools. There have been accepted ways of structuring courses, putting them online, delivering them, and so on. And I think they have to move beyond that to deal with this flow and the ambiguity and become craftsmen. You still have to master the tools, the techniques, but you have to become more of a diagnostician, a consultant, a change agent, an enabler, a facilitator, able to hybridize designs. In other words, become more of a craftsman and less of just a mechanic. I mean, good mechanics are craftsmen, of course.
Of course, and you cannot be a master of your craft without mastering the basics.
Exactly.
But if that's the case, is that all one needs to do to be an exemplary performer in L&D in the future, or does Wirearchy demand new skills, new attitudes?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that, other than I think, as I mentioned in the presentation today, that we're really only at the start of this, and that things like the Internet of Things, algorithms, nanotechnology, new materials, new ways of publishing, new ways of ingesting information, and on, are going to imply a greater ability to be in the flow, deal with ambiguity. A notion that I like to think about is what I'd call open focus. There's a sport, I believe, that's long distance archery.
Yes.
Where you need to shoot an arrow and try to hit the bullseye of a target, and it's, let's say, 500 meters away. I don't exactly know what the lengths are. That's not the same as focusing on a bullseye target that's 50 meters away. You have to have sort of what I'd call a 1/3 of a near focus, 1/3 of a focus in the middle of the flight of the arrow when it's in an elliptical trajectory, and you have to have a far focus for being able to make the tip of the arrow hit the bullseye. And I think that that is probably an idea that's transferable to working in the learning and development field, which is up close, and there are some kinds of things that need structured learning that will be best served by the existing tools, techniques, models, and practices, whereas some of the less tangible uses, if you remember, there was a book about intellectual capital about 15 years ago by a guy called Tom Stewart.
Sure.
The innovation and the creation of value, whether it's economic value or social value, comes mainly from the use, the shaping of intangible intellectual capital, knowledge that's found in design. People buy design because all of a sudden something's more attractive, more useful, 10 times more efficient, and that's been typically because of the application of new knowledge to a situation. Dave Snowden would call it exaptation often, which is not adapting something, but all of a sudden you find a new use for something, and that results in a leap, an order of magnitude change in utility,
it's not incremental, but what happens is some things are combined together, and then there is a quantum leap to the next. Well, I say the next.
A new use for it.
Yes, a new use for it. Do you want to give a quick sound check to Dave Snowden's work with the Kniffen framework? Because I think that is something which anybody from L&D listening in should be aware of.
Well, his site is cognitive-edge.com. Dave is a real pioneer in applying complexity science to navigating organizational issues and applying complexity principles to management by recognizing that increasingly information flows are making situations that before were known, complicated, into more complex things. And he's identified a number of ways to go about identifying the situations and then responding to them.
Right.
So I think it's very seminal and pioneering work, and I can't see it becoming anything but more and more important over the next 10 to 20 years.
Talking about the ability to deal with ambiguity, I think it's a very good way of talking about how different.
Well, it helps reduce the ambiguity because it allows you to see and understand, I guess, reference points or landmarks in the situation you're in that say, oh, okay, this is complex, so therefore I need to consider, for example, in the complex arena, if I'm not mistaken, it's sense and then respond and then analyze what the response has been, versus complicated, which is analyze, respond, and then sense.
Rather, so in other words, sometimes, depending on the situation you're in, it's better to just take action and see the result rather than try to overanalyze.
And then recalibrate based on what happens after that action.
Yeah, because by the time you've taken the time to analyze things, the situation may well have moved on.
It would be like facing a complex situation and developing a learning strategy and putting it into practice, and then finding out that nobody engages with it or it's not particularly useful because of something you weren't aware of, where it would be a lot better to launch a couple of lightweight experiments and see what happens and then build on it.
And it's a very practical example of how the new world of knowledge is very different to the way, knowledge and organizational structure is very different to how it was in the past. Now, I use the term rapid prototyping in the sense of getting out a minimum viable product makes a lot more sense in most cases, probably with learning technologies in large organizations.
And that's very close to, or another way of phrasing something that also has been has grown in significant awareness over the last, I'd say, 3 years, which is design thinking.
Yeah.
And Roger Martin at the University of Toronto has a book out about that, and applying design thinking to organizational change, management practices, and so on, which is effectively building prototypes and then getting into feedback loops with the intended customers, clients, market, and then iterating again and again and again, which fits very much with the dynamics. I would argue that from here on out, unless something drastic changes, we're in what Harold Jarkey calls perpetual beta.
Yeah, or perpetual beta, as we say here.
Beta.
I think actually the Greeks probably said beta, but you know, you can't change
beta are little goldfish, or sort of the fish that you buy, right?
Is that right?
Yeah, I think you buy them in plastic bags and come home and put them in a jar, and
they die after a week normally. Yeah, there we go. You're talking about the Middle Ages and the structure of knowledge in the Middle Ages. That really, as you were talking, gave me a vivid picture of a chapel I saw in Florence, where literally you had the archangel on top and literally a series of senior angels underneath, and then underneath those, the philosophers. It is an organizational structure reporting into each of these saints who is in charge of.
It's an org chart.
It's an org chart. It's an org chart for knowledge, and it shows that it's all structured and all leading to one powerful source. Against that, of course, then at more or less the same time, you've got the Gutenberg press. You said we're right at the beginning of the change that's going to happen to knowledge, organizational structures as a result of the wierarchy. So in Florence in the 15th century, split into the 16th century, we had the press already, but it wasn't having its impact. Do you see the same thing? It took about 100, 200 years for the full impact of the press.
There's the phenomenon of internet time. So you could, arguably, I don't know what the factor is, but you could say 200 years might be compressed down to 50 years.
Yeah, something like 30, 50 years.
But I think we've only had the graphical user interface that allows us to browse the web since 1995, I guess, the Netscape Mosaic. So that's 20 years. And it's the sociology and psychology that will win out in the end, not the most of the technologies become incredibly easy to use, and we have an app economy now and so on and so forth. The big adaptations, I think, will be psychological and sociological. I guess the best way I would, if somebody's really interested in this, there's a trilogy of books that I think read in order are very, very useful. And it's by a fellow named David Weinberger, who was one of the 4 authors of the book, The Clue Train Manifesto.
I'll come back to Clue Train Manifesto in a minute.
And, it was both much ballyhooed and much derided over the last 20 years, but, it's still pretty pertinent in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But David subsequently wrote a book called Small Pieces Loosely Joined, A Unified Theory of the Web, followed by Everything is Miscellaneous, The Power of Digital Disorder, which I would argue is he's starting to lay down the bones for a new theory of knowledge.
Right.
And the third book then was Too Big to Know, What Happens When the Room is Smarter Than Anybody in the Room, or something like that. All of them are pointing to the connected information flows, connected people, connected minds, connected energy, connected motivations that are leading to different uses of knowledge than top-down command and control.
I do believe we are moving towards a new world of knowledge, a new way of people organizing knowledge individually and collectively. And it's something you see incrementally in the day-to-day world, so you don't notice it. You step back 5, 10 years, it becomes quite vivid.
Yeah.
again, back to the learning and development community, if that's happening, and coming back to Clue Train Manifesto, the number one thesis was markets are conversations. If that's what's happening, if people are organizing knowledge collectively in the same way that Clue Train Manifesto would have it, we're organizing markets collectively, and knowledge is individual reflection, sometimes on a collectively shared pool. How does that alter the learning and development role?
That's a fascinating question, and there's a sometimes I speak in books, and there's a much overlooked book that came out in, I would say, the mid-1990s,
right,
by an academic at Georgetown University or American University in Washington by the name of William Halal, H-A-L-A-L. And this would be back in the heady days of the first generation of knowledge management,
right,
where he was arguing that because of networks and hyperlinks and so on, we could and should begin thinking about internal markets for knowledge,
right,
markets for knowledge inside the organization. And of course, you know, in many of the collaboration platforms and in organizational network analysis, a la map that I put up that Valdez Krebs' work delivers, the visual analytics of information flows in organizations, you can see that the notion of internal markets for knowledge and where do I go to get the pertinent knowledge now when I need it is an extremely valuable concept. But again, this is dissonant with silos and reporting relationships.
Because the Krebs map doesn't match the organizational structure.
No, it's like taking an X-ray or an MRI, but it shows actually what happens. Who do you go to? When do you go to them? When you need to know something, when you need to get something done. Arguably, that's a much truer picture of reality than the org chart with the reporting lines of relationship and so on, so forth, which is much more of a delineation of the formal power structure and status. In other words, you know, vice president is a cardinal or a bishop. The CEO is the king who is God's representative on earth.
And we make our way down to, I don't know, the usher or the lowly member of the congregation at the bottom.
The soldiers and the people that draw up the drawbridge and the people that wash the laundry and so on and so forth.
So we have this world in which originally, perhaps, let's go back to the 15th, 16th century, we have an organizational structure and a knowledge structure which are more or less congruent.
Yes.
That isn't what's happening now.
No.
Increasingly, the distance between the two is what gives us that sense of unease with Wirearchy being the reality of organizational structure.
Well, it's more fluid, it's less predictable, and management science starting, you know, the high disciple of management science was Frederick Taylor, and if you, he's much misinterpreted. There's some very, very important things that he established, but he also was, you know, primarily an efficiency seeker, which is to assume that once you get a process right, it's going to stay like that. It's static. And a lot of this thinking just did not foresee the fluidity of information flows. And his work got codified into all these practices and principles that now have become all the models of management science. And of course, there have been nuances. There was, and you probably know this from long ago, there was theory X management, theory Y management, and theory Z management. But theory Y management was much more participative, inclusive. And that was related to the work of the grandfathers of the OD world, you know, the Hawthorne experiments and all the kinds of things that suggest that, yes, you need processes and structure, but you also need to involve people and engage people in what they're doing, because nothing is ever perfect.
So just thinking about this business of this dissonance between organizational structure and knowledge flows and the theoretical structure of it, again, coming back to the learning and development community, if there is this difference between the two, and management has been using out-of-date structures and models to work with and to have not just a sort of a representational model, but actual representational model of how the world works. That's how they see the world. In learning and development, are we doing the same thing? Are we seeing the world now typically through a prism that worked 10, 15 years ago and is out of date and needs to change to accommodate the hierarchical truth of the future?
Again, it's a difficult question to answer. I think.
I'm sorry, I'll keep giving you these questions which are intangible and impossible to answer.
What we've seen in the last 20 or 25 years is a gathering of concepts, that start with something that I think infects people's minds, again, based on core assumptions, which is you can't manage what you can't measure.
Right.
And so there's been an ongoing obsession with metrics, performance metrics, KPIs, and so on and so forth.
Partly driven by short-term.
Well, yeah,
goal
because certainly if you're a publicly traded company in the UK or the US or Canada or France, your performance and your share price depends upon your quarterly performance.
Yeah.
And so, the wisdom has been you need metrics to be able to gauge your progress, shift your direction, shift your emphases, and all of that is true. But having covered all aspects of work with metrics, measurement, KPIs also leads to constraints and what I call straitjackets.
Sure.
On not being able to be flexible, innovation, and responsive. And if you look at the business section of bookstores, for the last 20 years, it's gone from being, let's say, one shelf width to 15 shelves width. And most of the books are about how to be innovative, how to be responsive, how to be flexible. I remember a very important book called The Boundaryless Organization. Dave Ulrich, I forget who, and there's also Tom Malone at MIT, the Future of Work, arguing for boundary spanning, breakdown of silos, all in the search of being able to respond. What we've seen, and I'm old enough to have seen that there's been this ongoing, it's like deep sea currents, inexorable creep towards more and more and more fluidity and less static, stable sets of operations. So the only way I think to respond to this, and I'm hoping, of course, is by taking on the definition of wierarchy, or call it what you will, I don't really care, except that I'm associated with wierarchy, but you could call it network structures, you could call it network dynamics. And I think that the key issues are knowledge, trust, credibility, and a focus on results, and start thinking about, in a given context, for a given organization with a given purpose, what does this mean to us? And what does this mean for our structure, our culture, our management practices, our leadership styles, and so on.
One final question then, Jon, before we have to wrap up. You talk in books, you peppered your conversation here with many references. Impossible question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What one book, when anybody watching this, one book should they go away and read to give themselves, apart from your own ebook, should they take away and read to give themselves a new vision of what's coming down the line?
I'm going to give you two books, but by one author. One of them was written in 1975,
right,
and it's titled Understanding Organizations, right, by Charles Handy, who's a British business philosopher. And then probably about 20 to 25 years after that, he wrote a book called The Hungry Spirit.
Right.
I would recommend both of those books.
Fantastic. Jon Husband, thank you very much for coming here, speaking with us today, and for taking the time out to do this interview, and look forward to staying in touch and continuing to map the future together.
Thank you very much. Have I convinced you that wierarchy is an emergent principle?
I was already there, so I'm afraid you've added to the weight of your evidence.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
It's good to have you. Bye for now.